So now it's time to migrate our selectors out of this index file. Now, we've got a comment here that says pizza state, and we've got all of our selectors. Now, as our applications grow, this isn't a very scalable architecture to keep everything in a single file. So what we're going to do, if you click on the store folder, we're going to create a selectors folder. So inside of this selectors folder, we can first off create an index.ts, and secondly, we want to create the pizzas.selectors.ts file. So we've got two files, pizzas.selectors and the index.ts. So what we're going to do is jump into that initial one with all of our selectors, and what we want to keep in here are these things. We want the product state, we want the reducers, and we want a reference to our product state. Now these three things lie inside of here because inside of this reducers folder, what we're actually going to do is have multiple reducers, and they all are part of this products feature module, which is why it's called a feature selector. So what we actually want to do is start to move things to do with the pizza state across into their own pizza selectors file. So let's go ahead, we can remove the comment, we don't need that. And we're just going to take these items downwards. We can cut and move across into the pizza selectors and just simply paste them in. Now inside the index file, what we're going to do is export everything from the current directory, and we'll export the pizzas.selectors. So this will then pass everything up to our store, which means that inside this index.ts, we also need to do the same. So we're going to duplicate this and say selectors. So we're making sure that we're passing things up twice. Now, just to make sure, this index.ts lives in the root of that store folder. So that's where we're passing everything up another level. So we can close that off. We've got the selectors folder with the index in. At the moment, we're exporting just the selectors, and we can close that off as well. So we need to import a few things, and we also need to remove one or two things from here as well. We no longer use this create selector, so I'm going to go ahead and just delete this. This puts everything onto one line. It looks super clean. We've got our action reducer map, which is where we just type our reducers to say this is the map of the reducers. It conforms to the product state, so we definitely want these things to exist in this one file. So the index.ts, and I mentioned this earlier on in the course, and that I would highly recommend this approach. And this is why we can break things out into like a main file where our other reducers can simply consume or reference some of the data that we've actually created. So let's switch back to our pizza selectors. We obviously need to import the create selector. So let's go ahead and say import create selector from our NGRX store. So that takes care of that issue. We've got the create selector now imported. So the first thing that we need, we're going to import everything as from feature. Now, because this is a feature module, we're going to actually ask for some of the logic that we put in that index file inside the reducer. And we get that from back one directory in that reducers folder. Now, this is technically equivalent to /index. In that index file, we have everything to do with this. So we can reference the reducers if we want, but what we're interested in is this get product state and perhaps the interface. So let's go back and continue. So instead of this get product state, we want to actually call it from feature.getProductState. Similarly, we can say from feature product state. The next thing that we need to import is this from pizzas. So we're going to, instead of looking at the index, we're going to go directly to the file. So we can duplicate this and we can say from is going to be pizzas, and that's going to come from the pizzas reducer. So we've cleaned up everything. Everything looks nice. There's no red underline. So it's actually at this point where we want to take that data from the router store and then compose it to go and select an individual pizza entity based on the root param. So if the root param is 2, we can go and look up our map of identities using that param ID. So what we're going to say is above here, and I like to keep these in a logical order. So we're going to say as from root. Now we get that from back 3 directories here in the app, and then we can go into that app store folder. So I mentioned that we keep these logical. We start like parent, child, which is a feature, and then we can keep things a little bit more granular if we want to import something more specific, like our pizza reducer. Now there's one change that I want to make to the routing structure, so before we go any further, let's just change something inside of here. Now at the moment we've got a path with the ID. Now when we actually want to select some of the router state, we might actually want to be more descriptive to avoid any naming collisions or perhaps being confused of what property that is an ID actually exists in the route path. So we're going to rename this to the pizza ID. What we can do is swap these round as well to make sure that this one definitely gets hit last. As it stands, this will completely work, but we want it to try and match the path of new first, and then as a fallback, we can then request that as a pizza ID. So in fact, inside of our state tree, we're going to have a route param with a property of pizza ID and then the value, which means that then we can go and compose this in our selector. So what we are actually interested in is creating a new selector, and we can say export const. This time we're going to call it get selected pizza. So we're calling this the selected pizza because when we navigate to /1 or /2, that in itself, we want to say that that is the selected pizza. And we know it's the selected pizza because the route params are telling us that we are currently at that route. So we can then go and select the piece of state necessary, bring it back from the store, and render it in our application. So this is the thinking of the flow. So let's go ahead and we can say create selector. Now the first argument, we want to pass the entities. So we're going to take this selector here and we can pass it in as the first argument. Now the second argument, and the reason that we imported from root, is because when I hit the dot, we can see that we have get router state. So when we hit this, I can click through. Now this is all to do with that router reducer and that custom serializer that we set up a few videos ago. So we are asking for a reference to the router reducer, which then means we can access the state object on the router. Now this exists in the state in our NGRX store. So at the moment we have a selector, we've got the get selected pizza, and we're going to create a third argument to this. Now instead of passing another selector, we're actually going to pass a function that accepts the entities and the router. Now this is going to return us a pizza item. So we can go up the top and actually import this. We can say above here, import the pizza from, we go back a few directories into that models folder where we can select the pizza model. So we're just typing this just to make sure that everything's fine. So when we go back inside of our function, what we essentially want to do is use the router state to then look up an entity. And this is the whole reason, not just for performance reasons, that we get a bigger gain when it comes to using an entity. We don't have to iterate over collections. We don't have to map through them to just simply update something. We can reference an entity by looking up its ID directly. It's super fast. So the benefit, again with this, is the router state will actually tell us the ID of the pizza that we are on. So what we can say is return router.state, and we're going to use and here. So we're going to check that the router state exists, and then if so, we're going to say entities, square bracket, router.state.params, and you can see, if I go back, you can see that params is referencing this router state URL. And you may remember that from when we actually set up this custom serializer to give us the pieces of information that we want. So you can see that we have params, query params, and the URL. And these were the things that we used in the custom serializer to then bind them directly to the store. If in fact you need a specific use case where you need another object from the store, you can add this directly to the router state URL, and it will be available in TypeScript in these options. So the one that we want is in fact the params, and the params will then have that pizza ID. So in fact we are looking up that entities, which is just a map as you can see, we have ID number, and we are simply passing in the current ID from the router state. Now the selectors make it really nice, really easy, and once you get used to them, it is absolutely fantastic on how we can actually compose state via different states around our application. So here we're actually using some feature state in our products module, and here we're using some root state. We're asking for the state of the router and then composing new state to be returned to our application based off of this. And because these are just functions, we're going to learn how to test them as we continue. We'll also be testing the actions, the effects, and the reducers all at the same time. So the next part of this, once we've created this get selected pizza, we want to actually go and demonstrate it working. So let's open up the containers. We'll go into the product item and open up the product item.component. Now at the moment, there's a lot of logic in here to do with the pizza service, the topping service, the routes, and you can see that they've got the router and the activated route and these types of things, and they get very repetitive. Now, while we were setting up this custom serializer, you may have been thinking, oh wow, this takes a lot of boilerplate, and I'm not sure if I want to use it. Now the benefit of this is we can completely just obliterate the router in every single one of our components. When the router state is bound to the store, we do not need it. Which also means that in our case, we can completely get rid of any services. What I'm also going to do is completely empty my NGRX, so we can reset these. Inside the onSelect, we're also going to reset these. Inside the onCreate, we'll empty these. OnUpdate, we'll also do the same. And inside of this if remove, we can just empty this out as well. So this is what we're going to be ending up with. Now there's a few things that we want to import and then inject, and one of them is the store. So let's jump up the top, import some observables, and make sure that we can hook up our new selector and then bind it directly to the template, and it's going to render out that selected entity based on the ID in the URL. So what we can say, we can delete the topping service. We'll keep the topping because we need this for type checking purposes. We can also remove the router and the activated route, so we don't need any of those anymore. We can bump these down just to keep them separate. And what we want to do is import our store from our NGRX store. Now the next thing, we're going to also import the observable operator, so we can use this for type checking as well. Now we get this from rxjs/observable. There's one final thing, then we can get things hooked up. So we want to import everything as from store, and we get that from back a few directories into our store folder. So we've got the store, we've got the observable, we've got our reference to all of our logic, so we can use things like our selectors. So let's go down and finish this piece off. Now what we're going to actually change is this pizza over to an observable, but we'll do this momentarily because we want to set up the store to be injected first. So we'll say private, and store is then going to be of type store. We can say from store, and that's going to reference the product state. So here we can use the generic type again, just make sure that we're actually using that correctly. So the next piece, we can go to our NGRX. Now we want to reference this.pizza. However, because we are now going to select data from the store, we're going to add this dollar suffix, which means that this dollar needs adding here, and it also needs adding inside this template. Now, because we're going to return an observable, we need to add the dollar, and we need to add the async pipe. So when we're subscribing directly in the template, which is essentially what the async pipe does for you, when you pass it an observable, it will subscribe for you, and it will also unsubscribe when the component is destroyed. So we don't need to do any ng-on-destroy type cleanup. So this is pretty much ready. Let's carry on and actually assign that selector that we just created. So we'll say this.store.select. Now we want to look at the from store, and we have a few options. So we can go for all of the pizzas, entities loaded, but what we're interested in is the get selected pizza. Now this is red underlined because we need to mark this as an observable. So this would then finish this off. We can say this will be an observable of a pizza. Now that's pretty much it. We've saved quite a lot of headaches. We've used a simple selector. We don't have to deal with the router at all. Angular's router is working in the background. We can use it as we like. But when it comes to components and composition of the data, we can use the benefit of using the single state tree and actually use a query via our selector to ask for that router state and then compose it against some of our entities, which is exactly what we're doing here. So let's save this out and we'll go and check this out in the browser and see what it gives us. So back in the browser, we have 3 pizzas. These are being driven via our dispatch. So we're loading those pizzas. Now, when I click on this one, for example, just remember the name Seaside Surfing. When we click on this, you can see that this is now been populated in the input. Now this is being driven from the URL. So when we go back and select number 1, we have number 1 in the URL and it corresponds to that entity's ID. And in that one line of code, we have used the router state. We've gone off to our entities in the store and we've brought back that pizza. And you can see that this is extremely fast. There's no requests happening. Everything is in that centralized store. Now you may see when you click on a pizza and refresh, for example, that this name will actually disappear. This is because we don't have any guards to actually protect these routes and make sure that those pizzas exist in the store before we try and access them. So as we continue through the course, we'll actually be setting up a root guard to actually check whether the pizza's entities do exist in the store. Now you may remember earlier on, we looked at the loaded and the loading properties. Now the loaded property we set to true when our pizzas have been loaded. So that's how we're going to know when we use a root guard in future whether something has been loaded. Otherwise we're going to dispatch an action and make sure that we protect these routes so that we could view the pizzas if they exist. But for now we can access them via this page, so we can hit this view, we can click on one because in the previous view they do exist in the store. So I hope this kind of opens your mind to state management and how we can use the router state alongside our data structures to actually compose the state very easily using the selectors. And we've also looked at using a selectors folder and creating a selectors file to manage things at a bigger scale, because when our application scales, we need to know that the folder structure is going to scale with us.